Good morning. My name is Marcelo. We're going to change the topic around a little bit. We're going to talk about something that is very hard to forget if we're talking about navigating the future, and that's global resource constraints. We could have gone a number of different directions with this topic, as you can imagine. Some of our colleagues have already touched on energy, the food aspect. We could talk about land and agriculture. We could talk about materials and minerals. But we chose to talk about water. We felt that it was a very compelling case, and also one that's been a little bit overlooked. So I'd like to start by telling you a story. I want you to imagine an executive in 2050. We want to walk through his day, and we're going to start, could be a nice Norwegian executive like Axel over there. We're going to start in his morning. He goes over to his rainwater collection receptacle and grabs some water so he can brush his teeth. He goes onto his breakfast table, eats some jam and toast. You notice there's no dairy products because it's too expensive. He gets in his car on his way to work, and he turns on the radio, and he hears about all the water-related conflict around the world, especially the one between India, China, and Pakistan over their shared resources in the Himalayas. He gets into the office and has a meeting with his finance officer, who's talking about his water hedging strategy because he's concerned the price of water has been steadily going up. Then he receives an urgent call from his operating officer, who's concerned about the amount of leakage from their pipes and their plants, and he wants to implement a program to cut that down and save thousands of dollars a year. At the end of the day, our Norwegian executive goes home. He has a nice vegetarian dinner, and then suddenly the power goes off because the hydroelectric plant up the street didn't have enough water running through it to generate enough power for the night.
Well, this story might sound far-fetched, but in fact, it's already taking place. Just look at the recent conflict or discussion between Egypt and Ethiopia about the resources of the River Nile. This situation could potentially lead to protests and social unrest and cause a destabilization of the region. In Mexico, we already see examples of rationing and social inequality as a result of water scarcity. In Australia, water trading is already taking place, and India is accused for water terrorism against Pakistan. So, let's bring some meat into this presentation and talk about some everyday products. To raise an ox, you need water for drinking. You also need water to service the ox, but in fact, this only represents 1% of the total consumption. What is more important is the grains and the grass you need to feed it, and this accumulates to 99% of the total. So, in order to produce one single piece of meat for a hamburger, it takes 2,500 liters of water. But let's look at a few more examples. A cup of coffee, 140 liters. A slice of bread, 40. And an orange, 50. But this does not only apply to food. It also applies to clothes, like a t-shirt. 2,700 liters of water. A pair of jeans, 11,000. And a pair of shoes, 8,000 liters. And how many liters of water do you think it'll take to produce a single cotton bud? Not 1, or 2, or 3, but 3.6 liters of water for a single bud. So, what implications does this have for on the global level? Starting with the demand side, we actually see that the total consumption over the next 35 years for the OECD countries will drop by 15%. Contrary, for the BRICS and the rest of the world, we'll see an increased demand of 80% over the same period. The combined figure for the entire world means a net 55% increase in water. So, look at the different segments. Manufacturing is by far the biggest driver. But we also will experience a doubling in the consumption in the domestic and electricity generation purposes. This leaves less water available for agriculture, and we will see a net 14% reduction available for production of food. Okay, so let's move over to the supply side and see how supply matches demand in the future. This is the total available water in the world. And of the grand total, only 2.5% is fresh water. Of these 2.5%, only this very small green dot here represents the fresh water that's accessible for human use. 0.3% of the 2.5%. And as supply hasn't increased that much over the last 50 years, we know that population growth and demand has increased significantly. This means that the average resources per capita from the 1962 level till today has dropped into half. And in 2050, we'll see an average resource per capita close to the current sub-Saharan African level. So how do we overcome this challenge? We see that the issue is more severe in some parts of the world than others. And we like to make a difference between what we call physical economic water scarcity and economic water scarcity. So in the case of Mexico, a combination of increased use in industry, agriculture, and water export agreements with the US has caused a situation of overconsumption and what we call physical water scarcity. This means that the replenishment rate is not sufficient to have a long-term sustainable supply. On the other hand, in Africa, we have a situation called economic water scarcity, where there actually is enough water to support business and the population, but there is not enough investments or government initiatives to develop the sources. In India, we see a combination of the two, where overuse, pollution, and lack of investments has created a situation of both physical and economic water scarcity. So, if I go to Australia, I get 1 liter of Evian bottled water for $2.50. In Australia, I can also go to the tap in the kitchen, and I get 1,000 liters of water for the same amount. If I lived in Mexico, I would get 5,000 liters of water for $2.50. So with this fantastic span, which price is correct? Actually, this huge gap in pricing leads to the statement of Peter Brabeck that water is so undervalued that it's typically used inefficiently. But price is not the only way of regulating demand. We also have regulatory instruments like bans and restrictions. We have norms and standards. We have land zone use and regulation. We have economic instruments like insurance schemes, tradable water rights, and subsidies. And on the information instruments, we have eco-labeling, certification, and education. So how will this affect the people in this room and your business in the future? We believe that by 2050, water will turn into a raw material on the same level as you consider electricity, hydrocarbons, and minerals today, and it will represent a significant part of your cost. In turn, this could lead to changes in your supply chain. Coming from a traditional situation where you either locate your factory close to your consumers or close to a source of cheap labor, now you have another concern, and that is the access to water. So it may be that in the future you will locate your production close to water-rich areas, as it's more efficient to transport your finished goods than to transport water over a long distance.
Thank you, Axel, for that summary of the problem, I would like to now invite you to think about your own companies and how well you understand your own exposure to water risk. Start here with an example of Foodco. It's a good example of a company that seems to understand its water footprint very well across the entire business system. You'll see that it even understands in the agriculture perspective here from its suppliers, and it makes a distinction between green and blue water, which you can learn more about in our workshop later. But I'd like to ask you to think about your own business now and think about 4 important questions to gauge how much you really understand what your water risk exposure is. Do you individually know if your business tracks its water consumption and if it understands the embedded water risk from its suppliers and from the raw material it uses? I'd venture a guess that actually not too many people do. Has your company actually integrated water risks into its business planning? Does it talk about it as it talks about other risks that it's exposed to? Do you individually know what to do if there is a water-related disaster and your company is affected by it, if there's some kind of a supply chain disruption? Does your company have scenarios that it informs to all employees to know what to do? And finally, do you know if your company engages with key stakeholders, such as the government, even the public at large, or its suppliers, to really understand what its water risks are? And we'd like to touch on some scenarios that we analyzed. These are by no means inclusive of everything, but there's some interesting trends that we could see happening in the future that could have a severe impact on business, and that's really worth thinking about. I'd like to call your attention to what we identified as high probability and high business impact. We could see, for example, massive mega projects that span international borders, such as pipelines or other kind of infrastructure water trade that could really impact or change the scenery of where you get your water from, depending on where you're operating. You could see regional conflict. We already touched on areas that have a little bit of dispute over their shared sources. And this could escalate into a level that could really lead to something much more serious. We could see some political alliances in water-rich countries, or the dynamics between water-rich and water-poor countries could have an implication for business in the future. Certainly, we've already seen a lot more public scrutiny. People are paying attention to what companies do to make sure they are good stewards and they're good members of the community. And this has already become the case for water, and we expect that will only continue. And we could even see some technological advances in ways in which you could substitute water from your production processes or find other ways to cut down on your use. With that, we'd like to invite you, if you'd like to learn more about the topic and go in more details, some of the cases that we looked at, to come to our workshop later today. We'll cover the water scarcity issue at the individual level, what that means for you as a person, give you a chance to even maybe learn what your own water footprint is on a day-to-day basis. We'll cover the business level, talk in more detail about the business risks that arise from the water scarcity issue. We'll talk about some cases like the case of Ford and Coca-Cola, who we feel did a good job with their water stewardship programs. And we'll give you some tools that you can take with you to maybe understand better how your company is assessing its water risk, and if there's something you can do differently or do better. And we'll also talk about the government level, where we'll see what kind of policies are coming into play and what kind of technology or solutions are down the pipe, which could change the issue of water scarcity for business and for all of us. So join us upstairs. We'll be at M230, and we'll have 2 sessions, as you know, and we look forward to seeing you there.